Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Trialogue's 5th webinar in the series. I'm just going to wait a few more seconds because I can see attendees join in, and then we'll kick off. Okay, I'm just going to start with some technical notes. We're obviously doing this webinar on Zoom. We've turned off the chat functionality, but we'd really encourage all participants to ask questions and participate through the event using the Q&A functionality. So the second half of this webinar is dedicated to Q&A with the panelists, and if you can just write your questions into that, and please direct it to one of the panelists and make it as short and succinct as possible so that I can get through them all. But that's what you're going to use for that, the Q&A button. Then just to let you know that immediately after the webinar, and again tomorrow, there will be an opportunity to complete a feedback form. And I'd like to encourage you all to please do that. It helps us in determining what topics we're going to do next in the series. So please do, it's just a very short questionnaire. And then the last point is just that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the webinar, as well as all of the slides and an article on the outcome, the Trialogue Knowledge Hub in the next few days. So it will all be available. Okay, so I see we now have, to move on. There are a number of names that I do recognize, so hello to all of you that I do know, and to those that I don't, a quick overview. I'm Kathy Duff, one of the directors at Trialogue. Trialogue is one of only a few organizations in South Africa that focuses exclusively on corporate responsibility. So our tagline is around supporting better business. We do this in a number of ways. On the corporate social investment side, we've got two main categories of activity. The first is our consulting services, where we help organizations with their CSI strategies and the implementation of those. And we actually at the moment offering a strategy review or a fresh methodology to help companies rethink their strategies given what's happened with COVID. And we also do monitoring and evaluation. And one of our monitoring and evaluation specialists is on the panel, so you will hear a bit more about that then. The other main category of things that we do is knowledge sharing. And we do this to try and encourage collaboration, better understanding, and more effective CSI. So the main platforms for that are our Business and Society Conference. And I know I've mentioned this in all the previous webinars, but the registration is now open for the virtual event, which is happening on the 13th and 14th of October. We've got a really exciting lineup of speakers, and also there's great networking opportunities, and we really try to build an interactive experience. So I'd encourage those of you that haven't registered yet to register for that conference. The other main platform is the Business and Society Handbook, which was formerly known as the CSI Handbook. And we've actually finished the primary research for that. So to all the companies and nonprofits in the audience who participated, thank you. There is still an opportunity to advertise in that handbook. So you can get in touch with us if you'd like to do that. And the 2020 edition will be launched towards the end of the year. And then the third platform I just want to mention is the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, which is our online portal for information across the CSI space. And I'm excited today to announce that we have just launched the new topic, which is monitoring and evaluation. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Xenex Foundation. They have sponsored that topic on the hub, and there's lots of information and case studies around monitoring and evaluation. And I'm delighted that we have a representative from Xenex on the panel today to talk more to that topic. Okay, so why are we doing this topic? I guess monitoring and evaluation, we've always spoken about the importance of it. But it's one area now when things are changing so rapidly and a lot of budgets are getting cut, where sometimes we're seeing companies or nonprofits, implementers, think that M&E is one of the things that can be cut. And I think, you know, very importantly for us, is wherever possible to continue with M&E. And it's more important than ever in these changing times, because monitoring and evaluation can now help you to understand what are the new or changing needs of people. How do your programs need to be adapted or redesigned, and how effective are these new adapted programs or redesigned programs? So I think in times of change, which we're currently going through, M&E becomes even more important. And for that reason, we've decided to cover that topic today. And after I give a brief introduction, we're going to move on to three panelists. We're going to hear from Fatima Adama at the Xenex Foundation, who's going to give us the funders' perspective, how they've adapted their M&E. Then for the nonprofit perspective, we've got Lawrence Luseka from JAM South Africa, and then my colleague Zuleika Bray from Trialogue to talk about how we've adapted our evaluations in this period. And then, as I mentioned, we've got the second half of the webinar dedicated to Q&A. And there's the hashtag for those of you that are on Twitter to tweet. So let me just get to the polls here. But monitoring and evaluation, like everything, every sector, every program has been impacted by this pandemic and the resulting lockdown. Three main ways that it's been impacted. The first is we've seen most programs being somehow adapted. So changing their focus, changing parts of their design, changing parts of the way in which they implemented. And when this happens, it's important to review your monitoring and evaluation framework. Obviously, as the program changes, you need to assess, you need to review how you're going to assess the adapted program, how you're going to assess whether it's had an impact. So the first is really, keeping track of those changes in the program. The second there is the way in which monitoring itself is conducted. So how do we now collect the data? How do we track the indicators? This has become particularly relevant with social distancing and movement restrictions, because a lot of the face-to-face ways that things used to be done in terms of interviews, focus groups, surveys, that hasn't been possible. So how have we adapted monitoring to new ways? And that's something the panelists will speak to. And then the third one, again, is around evaluations. Again, similarly to monitoring, they can't be done, in many instances, they can't be done as they had been. So it's changes in the way that data is collected. But also there's become an opportunity for evaluations to add some value during this period, or to do new types of evaluations. So for example, to do evaluations of, or to assess the M&E framework and see whether it's still relevant given the adaptations to the program. There's the opportunity to assess how responsive the program design is and how adaptable it is. And also opportunities to look to evaluate these changes and to track the impact of these adapted and new programs. So I'm going to launch the first poll, which is really to ask everyone we've got in the audience, what monitoring and evaluation challenges are you facing as a result of COVID? And I think most of the people in our audience are nonprofits and corporates, and I would ask you now to please respond to that poll. Okay, I see some of the answers coming in. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, almost half of you have voted. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. We've got some nice results there. I'm hoping everyone can see that on their screens. But the category that had the most responses, so 45% of the responses, was the program was cut or delayed. And as I mentioned here in this first point, we've seen many programs being adapted, and indeed some of them being cut and delayed. So obviously if the program is delayed, monitoring and evaluation is delayed, and how can you look at adapting it in that time? And then the second most popular response there was shifting to digital data collection. And I think that's been very common, and that's something that we are going to discuss further. The panelists will talk to that in a bit. So just I'm going to just close that poll. The last slide from my side is around some of the recommendations that we would make. And obviously at a very high level. The first is, wherever possible, to keep monitoring and evaluation in place. The importance in terms of adapting your programs and your strategy has never been higher. So the first point is really around where you have adapted your programs, ensure that the frameworks are still appropriate. Then when there has been new programs or activities started, often these have been done in haste and they've been done collaboratively. So there hasn't been M&E frameworks put in place, and we'd encourage you to do that. If your M&E or your entire budgets have been cut, we would say at this point, prioritize the monitoring, and so continue to collect that data and track those indicators, as it's often difficult to get that retrospectively, and perhaps reprioritize or delay some of the evaluations. For the evaluations, ensure that you revisit the questions to see that they are still relevant in the new context. Review your data collection methods, and I think we're going to talk to this, but many data collection methods have moved to digital. Obviously, you need to consider various factors in this. Also consider the fact that you may get respondent bias due to the current situation. So bear that in mind as you conduct your monitoring and evaluation. Then the second last point there is around remembering the ethical considerations. So the informed consent and data protection and privacy. That obviously doesn't change, and it mustn't be forgotten in the haste that we sometimes move to adapt things. And then the last one is really, we've certainly found that a number of the new methodologies and data collection methods that we've implemented have resulted in efficiency gains, and they've worked well. So look at which practices have worked over this period and look at keeping them in the longer term. Okay, I'm going to launch the second poll now, and then we're going to move on to our three panelists. So if you can all vote now, how is your organization adapting its monitoring and evaluation as a result of COVID? And again, this is a multiple choice. So if you can all start your votes now. And while you're voting, I'd just like to introduce our three panelists. So from the Xenix Foundation, we have Fatima Adam, who's the Program Director of Research and Evaluations. From JAM, South Africa, we have Lawrence Leseka, who's the Design, Monitoring and Evaluation Coordinator. And from Trialogue, we have Zuleika Bray, who's a Senior Consultant in Monitoring and Evaluation. Okay, I see almost all of you have voted. A few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end that poll and share the results. And you can see there, the most common way that people have adapted is moving surveys online. So moving to the digital data collection, 47% of people said that. And I think that was followed closely by conducting phone or SMS surveys and putting safety measures in place for data collection. Okay, so thank you all for participating in those. And I'm going to ask the panelists to please turn on their videos now. Thank you. And Fatima, if you can turn on your speaker, we're going to start with you. And I'm just going to ask you to touch from a funder's perspective, what M&E challenges have you faced in this period, and how have you addressed them? Thanks, Fatima.
Okay, so good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share ideas on M&E with you and the participants. I think I want to start by saying that for Xenix Foundation, M&E is just as critical now as it's always been, right? In fact, maybe more so, right? So we need to continue to explore and explain and understand how COVID has affected education outcomes And we know that that COVID has had a significant impact on the education sector. And so because we need to use this to design appropriate interventions for now, the present, but also for the future. Because these impacts are here to stay for a little while. But we understand that we have to think of new ways of actually delivering M&E. And here is where we've tried a few things. Doesn't mean we working it out. I mean, that it's working. I just want to reflect a little bit on the lessons we've sort of encountered with the few things that we've done. So the first is obviously to align the design of your M&E with the redesign of your project. So it's the first step you have to go through, because you can't have M&E as usual when in fact you've changed your entire project design, okay? And this includes issues of delays. So if there's delays, then there's delays. We need to think through some of those issues. But what we start by saying is there's a few sort of lessons. The one is we must establish the evaluability of our projects. So can it be evaluated under these circumstances? What can be evaluated? So we need to do a kind of, is it feasible? We need to be practical, pragmatic, and feasible. Is it possible to evaluate this kind of a project under the circumstances that, in which we find ourselves? The second is we want to begin to undertake more rapid assessments and rapid review initiatives. So generally we find M&E is a long sort of initiative. It's slower, it's thorough, it goes over a longer period of time, but we want more rapid assessments and reviews introduced into the frame of M&E. And that's because we want to be able to quickly feedback, change, adapt what we're doing, so that we can move ahead. And it's sort of unprecedented, unknown times. We will then must manage with this sort of unknown space by being to be quicker and work with imperfect data. So that's a kind of thing. The next is that we must be more discerning and selective about the data we collect. Now we can always have so less is more. That's the principle we're applying. We need to think about what is essential and what is nice to have, because what happens with data collection and monitoring is, particularly monitoring, is we were collecting, not we, but generally, you find yourself interested in collecting everything about everything. And this is the time when we need to begin to prioritize and thin it, so that it's very essential, critical data that we need to use. We also began to use technology where possible. So phones to do interviews, using photographs that our evaluators even say that they want to do small assessments and surveys. But in order to do that, we must begin to think more carefully and critically about designing our instruments. Because what's happening now is that your instruments must be really precise, they must be brief, they must get to the heart of the matter, and they must begin to provide enough information. We're finding that the surveys that we generally design they don't suffice in this circumstance, because we can't triangulate with other methods. We can't go to the schools and check it and do interviews, all those other things in the same ways we used to. So our instruments must really be sharp, so that we can use the technology options where possible. We also need to, I think that some things could be done face-to-face. We mustn't rule it out, but we must be mindful about how we do that. We must have no harm done to people. We must abide by ethical standards. We must be mindful about the stresses that it places on people that are working under these conditions, particularly schools and teachers. So we kind of say that kind of stuff, print-based assessments, etc. We can do those. We must be very, very careful. They must be the last resort. Okay. And then we must acknowledge that some activities are out, and we must be realistic about that. We can't go into teachers' classrooms and conduct observations. It's a problem, right? They're fearful, we're fearful, the kids, we don't want to risk anybody. So such things must then be out of the fray. So just to conclude on this matter, I think that do less better, the motto, be clear about the purpose for M&E, so that you can then be more precise and discerning about what you do and what data you collect. Look for feasibility and evaluability, right? Because if you don't assess feasibility and evaluability, you're running up the wrong tree. And then we must balance the short-term, quicker turnaround possibilities with the long-term approaches. I mean, yeah, and it doesn't mean we're not struggling. We're struggling on. It's not work as usual. We're going to have to tamper with things to make them better. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. I think that's a great message. Fewer things better, and I'll add on another word to that from your intro, which is quicker. So the rapid assessment. So fewer things better and quicker. But I think it's a good point. And often our instruments are lengthy and asking for so much information. So to assess those and see what we can do quicker via technology to get the core information that we need. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Lawrence to ask him for his opening statement. Just as an implementer, how have your programs been adapted, and how have you adapted your monitoring and evaluation in this period?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for this opportunity. As you said, I'm from GEM, South Africa, where we mainly serve around 120 beneficiaries that attend ECD, early childhood development centers and around South Africa, mostly focusing on the underprivileged. During the announcement of the closure of ECD centers, we had to now change the way we distribute our food and also consider the families of the beneficiaries that we are serving, which gave us also the opportunity to engage with the parents or the guardians of the beneficiaries, and we would teach them around hygienic practices and also how to establish and maintain a food garden so that they can have food security. And in the way that we delivered our program, we had to make sure that we are COVID-19 compliant, in that we would make sure that our staff, as well as the people that come to receive the food, wearing masks, they are social distancing, and also make sure that they have been sanitized. With the consent of our donors, we repurposed our funds to now also have take-home rations, where we give the food parcels as well as the nutrient-rich porridge to the families, so that the entire family is being served and is not starving. We also had to change our monitoring and evaluation from focusing on the results and the outcomes of our delivery to now activities, and making sure that our activities that we planned are delivered as such. We also had a SMS voucher system that we adopted, which gave us an opportunity to be able to control our distribution, making sure that we don't have too many people coming to collect the food, which risks the spread of the COVID-19, as well as also to protect the dignity of the recipients that coming to collect their food. Our M&E also changed in a way that we were now conducting remote monitoring, as the poll has said. We were conducting telephonic conversations because some of our beneficiaries don't have access to internet. So we would check up on them via cell phones and calling them and asking what are the needs and how can we provide the support. And during our food distribution, it also changed the way we collect the information. We had to rely more on the ECD practitioners, as they were the ones who were doing the collection of the data and provide us with the reports for weekly. So our review reporting cycle had to change from monthly reports to weekly reports, just so that we can stay up to date on what is happening currently throughout the provinces. Yes, and that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think there's some interesting points there in how you've adapted your M&E and how you had to shift your focus from kind of outputs and outcomes to activities, because you were introducing all these new activities into your program design. Before we move on to the third speaker, can I just encourage people to start putting your questions into the Q&A? Because after we've heard from Zuleika, we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Okay, so Zuleika, as an evaluator, how did the evaluations that you were doing prior to and during COVID and the lockdown, how were those adapted? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks to the other panelists for your feedback. It's actually been very interesting to listen to you. So Trialogue as a monitoring and evaluation provider, we've also been affected in the way in which we go about doing our evaluations. We had a number of implementation and outcomes evaluations that were due to kick off in 2020. And when COVID-19 hit, we saw all these programs and all the organizations we were working with, things started to change, which was expected. We saw some programs which were paused, because they just simply weren't able to continue. And we saw that with the poll that came through now, that programs were just either cut or delayed. We saw some programs which were pivoted, and by this we mean either that the organization had shifted their focus to respond to a particular need that they identified, or alternatively, where the program stayed the same, the implementation modality of that program shifted, which resulted in having to look at the way in which the program works quite differently. And then in some cases, we had programs where we were fortunate where they just proceeded as normal. And given this, we needed to then relook at the way in which we did evaluations, not only in terms of what was happening in the program, but also with how we generally conduct evaluations. Was the evaluation still a priority to the client? What value could we add to the evaluation? How did our methodologies that we had originally proposed prior to COVID need to change? And the last one was timing. Where, given the movement restrictions, given that we couldn't move the way we wanted to, we needed to be very cognizant of the timing around the evaluations. We also had evaluations in different sectors. So we had some in the education space, we had some in infrastructure, youth employment, SME development, and each of these sectors had some aspects that we needed to be cognizant of. So for example, your schools were closed, your small businesses were closed. How do you actually do an evaluation in these circumstances? So what actually happened with our evaluations? Coming back to what Fatima said earlier, we had some clients where in the education space, they asked us to put all evaluations on hold, where they said to us that, with what is happening in the schools, there's limited teaching and learning that's happening. The time that they have is so valuable that let's rather not put additional pressure on them at this point in time. And fortunately, these programs, given the type of program it was, we were able to say, okay, we'll wait for some of the pressures to be alleviated and then we'll go into the schools. So we were able to do that. But we had other clients who felt that this was an opportune time for them to carry on with the evaluations because it would help to contribute and it would contribute to program improvement and the adapting and pivoting of programs given the current context. But then they asked us, like Kathy mentioned earlier, to also relook at the lens at which we're looking at our evaluations. So look at relevance in the current context, not only historically, which you would generally do in an evaluation. Look at the adaptability and flexibility of the programs, contribute to improving M&E frameworks. And one that was quite interesting that we could also add in was looking at the sustainability of outcomes in light of market shocks, or this type of a shock which nobody could have expected. So oftentimes when you would evaluate your program outcomes, you would assess it against what we thought we would achieve. But because of COVID, a lot of the gains or some of the gains in some of the sectors have been reversed. So for example, employment programs where people may have gotten employed, but because of COVID-19, they've lost that job. Or in SME development where a business may have seen significant business growth because of COVID-19, the business was now closed. So those are some of the nice things that we were able to add into the evaluations. We then looked at adapting our data collection strategies. And if you look at the poll that came through now, a lot of people have said that they've moved to digital systems, they've moved to online and remote data collection in order to monitor and evaluate their programs. And when we were looking at adapting our own data collection strategies, there were a number of considerations that we took into place before we made any decisions. And I just want to make mention of a few of them. The first one is around maintaining a good enough level of rigor. As an evaluator, you still need to ensure that whatever you're evaluating and whatever findings you make, they are based on sound evidence. And this is where triangulation becomes very important, where you're not making judgments prematurely. You're not making it on insufficient data points. You're not making them when facts are uncertain, or in the case of collecting data remotely, you sometimes have a convenience bias which comes in, where only people who have access to these digital platforms will respond to your survey, and therefore their voice is louder in the evaluation. So there's a number of these aspects that you need to take into consideration. The second one was around ethical considerations and the do no harm principle, that whatever platform we chose to use, we still needed to be able to take and record informed consent, and we needed to ensure that we had data privacy aspects in place. The third one was around contextual factors. Now, usually when you would do a face-to-face interview, some of these contextual factors are important, but they're not that detrimental to your evaluation, or they don't affect your evaluation so much. But when you move to remote or virtual or digital data collection, it becomes very, very apparent, because it does affect the willingness of respondents to participate. It may be an exclusionary factor where you don't realize that given the platform you're using, you're actually not allowing a particular type of stakeholder to participate, or it may result in a bias. And some of these are as simple as the age of the respondent, the gender of the respondent, the geolocation of the respondent, language barriers. You cannot generally just take an English survey and put it onto a platform and expect people to be able to respond to it a certain way. When you take a spoken survey or an administered survey, and it becomes a self-administered survey, you need to be careful that people interpret or respond to the survey in the same way. So there's a number of factors that you need to look at. Things like technophobia. A lot of us don't realize that there's quite a lot of people who don't like using, for example, social media. If you take social media as a platform and you administer a survey through that, there's just some people who don't want to use social media. So you need to be very cognizant of those factors. The fourth one was contact details. And here we rely heavily on the service providers and the implementing partners. And I cannot stress enough how important good user data is, because when we look at these databases that we sometimes get cell phone numbers, we sometimes get landline numbers, which under COVID were really not useful. We sometimes get email addresses. We don't have a complete set of data, which affect, again, what platforms we can choose and how we go about doing it. The fifth one was around costing and timing. Now, usually when we do a site visit, for example, we can knock out 4 or 5 different types of stakeholders over a very short period. You would speak to trainers, you would speak to service providers, you would speak to beneficiaries through intercept interviews, focus groups, etc. But now, because that option was no longer on the table, we now had to use 4 or 5 different platforms in order to access those very same stakeholders. So the costing and the timing considerations became very important. And then the last one I just want to touch about is unintentional bias due to the timing of the evaluation. As I said earlier, in a lot of these programs, there may have been gains that have come about because of the program, where the participants have seen some gains. But when the respondent is answering your survey or your questions, they're doing it in the here and the now. So if they have been negatively impacted by COVID, there is the possibility that the responses they give you is going to be clouded by their current situation. So the framing of your questions become very important, because that is not attributable to your program. It's not a result of your program. It's a result of a market shock. So how you interpret that becomes very, very important. So what did we do? I'll just touch on this quickly. The first thing that we did was we put more emphasis on secondary data. So literature, doing qualitative analysis of program documents, and making a lot more use of monitoring data that is already collected. And with the monitoring data, we obviously did light touch data quality assessments just to ensure that this data that we're using is sound, it's accurate, it's relevant, it's coherent, etc. We did semi-structured interviews as we would have, but we moved to virtual platforms. And the nice thing is that a lot of the virtual platforms that are available to us, like your Zoom and your Teams and your WhatsApps, they all have recording functionalities where you can ask for permission to record, and then you can get your informed consent and keep it that way. Observations, we weren't able to physically be on site where programs were still continuing. Where they had been adapted onto virtual platforms, we were able to join in and observe. Interestingly, one of the things that we did do where programs continued in the normal delivery way physically, and we couldn't be there as an external party, we actually joined via a video link where we put a computer on the side of the room and we observed the training session remotely. For our site visits, for infrastructure, obviously it's very difficult to assess infrastructure if you can't physically go and see it. But we did virtual walkthroughs with program managers where they literally took a computer and walked us through the infrastructure. There is, and we're going to caveat this and say it's not a perfect practice because we know that they could avoid showing us the crack in the wall, but it is one of the ways in which we could actually at least have an opportunity to see what was happening on the ground. Focus groups, we moved to WhatsApp. This was quite interesting because we needed to incentivize people to participate because there's a cost that they incur with joining for that 30 to 45 minute period. So we needed to incentivize them, give them a data voucher, and we also needed to over-recruit because we anticipated that we wouldn't get very high response rates. And then we also used a mix of electronic and telephonic surveys where we used platforms like SurveyMonkey, and we trained our own staff to conduct telephonic surveys. Last thing I want to touch on is that this was not a perfect science. We had quite a few challenges that we encountered. So I just want to go through 3 of them quickly. The one is the weaknesses in monitoring data that we encountered. Because we were relying a lot on monitoring data, what came through is that monitoring data is sometimes very focused on activities and outputs. And we often forget that there's an opportunity to collect outcome level data as part of monitoring. So for something like an SMME development program, you have a relationship with those organizations or those small businesses. You can collect turnover data, revenue data, job creation data on a continuous basis, which can feed into an evaluation, not only under COVID, but under general circumstances as well, where your evaluator then needs to do less primary data collection because you've already got some of that. The second one was inadequate, inaccurate, and incomplete contact information. Again, I cannot stress the importance of good user data, especially for doing evaluations via digital or virtual platforms. And then the last one is around low response rates, weak commitment, and how long the evaluation actually took. Because we had a thought that by moving on to digital virtual platforms, people would respond to us more. Or because we're reaching a bigger audience, we would be able to get a lot more responses. And we actually found the opposite. It took a lot longer for people to respond to us. We needed to send constant reminders. And as a result, the evaluation itself took a lot longer than we had planned. So it took a lot of planning and coordination. Yeah, those are some of our learnings. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Zuleika. I think some really interesting practical approaches and challenges that you've shared there in terms of walkabouts and WhatsApp focus groups and importance of user data. So thank you for that input. I'm going to move on to the questions and I'm going to start with those from the audience. So I'm going to give 2 over to you, Lawrence. The first is from a George Maurer. How did JAM monitor your garden project? You mentioned that you started a food garden project and someone's just asking how you monitored that. And the second one I'm going to address to you was, what was the response to the shift in your evaluation approach from results to process or activities? How was that received by your donors? And how severely was your budget changed because of that, and how did donors respond? So I'm going to give those ones, to hand those over to Lawrence to answer, please. And if you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, the audience, for your question. So for the food gardens, we actually do have a food garden program before COVID, but we were just training the ECD centers on how to maintain the food gardens. But then when we had an opportunity to engage with the parents or the guardians of the beneficiaries, we thought that was an opportunity to then expand that reach to also households. So we actually just provide training to the parents regarding how to establish and maintain a food garden. So the idea is that over time, we would then do like a visit to those households to actually see if they are putting to use or practicing the skills that we have given them in terms of establishing a food garden, as we were doing with the ECD centers before COVID-19. And then with the shift of the programming, it was actually the funders who were the ones who actually provided us with an option of how we can then change our programming, and they encouraged us to actually focus on what can be delivered So it wasn't, yes, there was a huge change in terms of our budget because we had more people to reach, but in terms of the process itself, it was actually encouraged by the funders. And when we asked for the change, it was actually encouraged by them that we are showing initiative in terms of delivering our programs.
Thank you, Lawrence. And that's actually something that's come up in one of the previous webinars, is almost the unprecedented dialogue and partnership between funders and implementers that has been a result of this, and hopefully one of the results that will last beyond the crisis.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm going to direct the next question, which is actually from an anonymous attendee, to Fatima, but it's also something I'm sure Lawrence can speak to. And it's an interesting one because it's, can you share some strategies on M&E in rural areas? Because most often these beneficiaries can't participate in digital platforms. So Fatima, did you encounter this, and how did you?
So, yes, I mean, I think it's not only rural areas. I think that's why I was saying where possible and feasible you can use technology. But I mean, you know, because it's not been a very long period. For some of our monitoring and evaluation work, people have collected data at a certain point. They've delayed some data collection. In others, we've tried to use, there's been SMS as an option, but that means it's a very short sort of conversation, and then telephone. So there's a lot of telephonic work going on because even in those areas, parents, for example, and teachers do have phones. And then finally, there are organizations who do evaluation work for us, who indicate that they can go in and get a pack of, say, learner workbooks, and then sort of take them, analyze them, and leave them back at the school in a careful way. Right, so some of it is to revert to print where it's possible and there's no harm to people, where a package is sort of delivered and the school can administer some of it. The only problem with that is that it leaves an extra burden on the school and the teacher to worry about some kind of documents, whether it's surveys or it's assessments, or any of those, or even for them, they have to now collect a set of learner workbooks and then leave it for somebody to bring back. So there's options of doing print and face-to-face, but these are kind of, you know, leaving packages and getting teachers to help manage and administer some of that. It's not the best, but in that in this time, I think the telephone has been the key, even in rural areas.
Thank you, Fatima. And actually, Lawrence, you also mentioned that you had done a lot of telephonic, and there's actually been a follow-up question on that from Mapitso, asking what SMS voucher system did you use? How did you do that for the beneficiaries so that they could respond?
Okay, so how it happened, we actually had a platform which developed a software that we upload the cell phone numbers of the parents of the beneficiaries from each school, and then the platform would send the SMSs with the content of the food, what is to be received, what is there to be collected from the ECD centers at what time, and where is the location. So when the beneficiaries come with their cell phones, they would show us the SMS voucher, and then as the implementers, we would then scan the SMS voucher system. We would scan the SMS, which would then confirm that the person came to collect the food. And as soon as that voucher is being confirmed as valid, we would then the beneficiaries then asked, did you receive the food, did you receive the contents that is in the food, to confirm that we actually gave the food to the beneficiary. So it was like a loop of information that was used in terms of the voucher system. And then the user would then reply, yes, I received, or no, I did not receive. in some cases, there were places where they had said, we're going to receive, in the list, it was 1 kg of powder milk, but we gave two packs of 50 grams of milk. So when the user saw that, they said, no, it's not 1 kg, it's 2 kg. So we had to be very specific in the list of the food that we provide. So that was some way we could be able to account on the food that we provide. That's how the SMS worked.
Thank you, Lawrence. So you used a software program for that. And I think it comes back to Zuleika's point of having good user data to ensure that you can actually get those vouchers to the right people on a valid cell phone number. Zuleika, a question that came through for you. Did you have any funders who would not accept a delay of M&E activities? And if yes, how did you handle this?
So fortunately not, but what we had done was, before we actually made any decisions, we had adapted our methodologies and we had discussions with all of our clients to say, if we want to continue, this is the new methodology we would need to use, and these are the pros and the cons. So even for those education program evaluations, which didn't ultimately go ahead, we had those discussions, we moved onto virtual platforms, we tried to see, how would it affect us being able to collect data based on all the different stakeholders that we would need to speak to. And from that, a decision was then made to say yay or nay, either go ahead or don't go ahead with the evaluation. So all the decisions that we made were made collaboratively with our clients. So we didn't actually make any decisions on our own.
Thanks, Zuleika. I think that reinforces what Lawrence was saying earlier about donors and implementers as well. This is a broad question, which I'm going to put to Fatima, because the Next Foundation focuses in education. And it comes from Tandazo, from an education nonprofit, who says, which evaluation approaches are most appropriate for educational programs during this time of crisis? I don't know if we've still got Fatima there.
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute. Look, I don't think there's any, I think there's delays. Okay? I don't think there's any one approach that suits. I think some things, for example, can't happen. So I think, like, if you can't do classroom observations, and your teacher is not able to do some of the recording, as Zuleika had mentioned, then you have to drop it, right? And then, for example, another one is learner assessments in early grades. So when you do learner assessments in early grades, you've got to do it face-to-face. It's not a written exam for most learners in the early grades. And it's a kind of verbal exam with an examiner almost and a child, and that also is not feasible. So you have to first. So one of the things you have to do is think about the evaluation and the monitoring frameworks for your project. Think about what it was and whether any of that is actually feasible, and then think about alternatives that may work. So some things are just out, and other things you have to sort of compensate. So you kind of think, okay, we can't do the learner assessments in the early grades. Can we ask teachers to do a few assessments and let us, send us the information? If that's not possible, then you think of other methods. You might think of interviewing by phone teachers as well as HODs, so you can do some triangulation. Maybe teachers can even give you pictures of work that they undertook, and let's say the ways in which they've marked children's work or things like that. There's a number of possibilities. There's no one method, and it depends on what your project's about, and therefore what you have to find. Because if it's a project that can live off just perceptions and perspective data, then it's easier. You can make a phone call, you can get a sense of what the HOD thinks about it, or the teacher. If you need something else like learner data, that then means you have to find a number of ways to help you get at that learner data. And you've got to go for less, and you've got to go for less numbers. So the sampling issues are definitely impacted in this way. And then it also depends on where your monitoring and evaluation is in the process. So for example, if you've done baseline assessments of learners and now you're coming to end line and you need to assess the same learners, it's a very difficult ask because you have to organize with the schools because schools are on rotation. So a school comes in, the grade 1 children coming today, well, let's leave grade 1, that's very difficult. A grade 8s are coming in on a Monday, and then the other half's coming in on a Wednesday. And you need to then align it with the learner you're retesting at the end. So it's all these difficult things. You have to align your project, your evaluation, your methods, and then really think of triangulation where it is possible and feasible.
Thank you, Fatima. So it depends on the program, but you've given some nice options in terms of the evaluation methods that are feasible in this time. I'm going to take the last question from the audience now, which is from a Karen, and I'm going to direct it to Lawrence before we move to our closing statements. So Karen asked, and I'm asking you this because you mentioned that you relied on ECD practitioners to collect some of your data. So she says, when working with community members to support data collection at sites that are harder to visit, what training or capacity building methods can be used to ensure the highest possible quality of data? So how did you, in your instance, train or build capacity of those ECD practitioners or community members to collect data? So Lawrence, you're on mute.
Okay, so this was done, the whole change of programming delivery was done in a very, very rapid way. So there wasn't any formal type of training that took place. But what our strategy is always relying on the locals to know what's best in how to approach certain communities or how to deal with certain personalities in terms of us requesting the data. So luckily, our regional coordinators have a very strong relationship with the communities and the community leaders. So they actually know exactly how to kind of get what they want from these people and these the mamas, the ECD practitioners, as well as the community members that they serve. But in terms of the overall training that we conduct, we would always have like a way. We had a session where we train people on how to kind of present themselves and show confidence, and also know how to speak about the things that they want the ECD practitioners to know about. It was mainly focused on the ECD practitioner, not on the specific topic of data collection, because that was done in a very quick way to say we're going to require data from these people, because the ECD practitioners were already tasked with collecting the information, but it was not a mandate for them to do it. But now we would solely rely on them, but it wasn't nothing new. So in that way, I think they were already supported in terms of collecting the information.
Okay, thank you, Laura.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I suppose the difference there is you had already, your ECD practitioners were already used to providing you with data, but it might have been a challenge to move to some form of online training where people weren't already doing that. Okay, just to say to those of you who've asked questions that haven't been responded to, they will be responded to, but not live, online. We have a few minutes left, and I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to end, and it actually does address some of the questions, with an overview of what recommendations or what is the key thing that our audience of nonprofits and corporates need to think about in terms of monitoring and evaluation during this period. So I'm going to go back to front from the order we went. I'm going to start with Zuleika just for a short closing statement, please.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for all the questions. I think some of them have also given us some food for thought. We're also obviously learning as this process goes along in terms of how to do M&E. But I think my key take would be that, when you're pivoting your M&E, you need to understand that there's no one size fits all. Every organization and every context is going to be unique. There's always going to be factors that you need to take into consideration when you are adapting your M&E, whether it be in terms of cost or, resources that you have available to you, etc. So there are a number of guides that have been put out, and Kathy will share some of the resources in terms of how you can go about adapting your M&E, what are good practices, etc. But adapt that to what your own unique situations are. And ask for help. I think a lot of the time again comes down to one of the points that were made earlier, where monitoring and evaluation tends to be the first thing that we drop when we are making changes to our programs. But if we can, ask for help, make sure that your M&E framework, when you adapt it, is rigorous, is the way you need it to be in order to collect your data and evaluate your programs. That also avoids problems later on down the line. So I would think work collaboratively, understand your context, and make sure that it's fit for purpose.
Thanks, Zuleika. Lawrence, I'm going to move on to you for your closing recommendation. Okay, Lawrence is on mute. Are you unable to?
I apologize. I keep losing my cursors. Sorry to the panelists and the members. Yes, so my take home is that, as my colleague has mentioned earlier, it's very important to ask questions and not just drop the easiest thing to drop, which would be M&E, which would mean lack of accountability. But in the long run, when you move forward, you will need it. You will have to account, you will have to report. So rather, it was important to be adaptable, to listen to what can work from your field staff as well as the donors, to have that bridge, and also engage with what you think is possible and what is not possible. We'd had to be very creative in how we conduct our information, and also our demands had to lessen a bit. We always require high level of data quality, but in this case, it was not possible to verify everything that we were given. So we had to actually put a disclaimer to our funders that this is the information we got. We are not 100% clear on the reliability, but this is the best that we can do with the situation at hand. So we need to learn to be flexible in terms of how we do our programs, consider the staff, take their input, take also what they propose, what is possible and what is not, because yes, we are all learning in this situation. I don't think there's anyone that can say they're an expert in this current situation. So take in everything that can be given to you, and also be adaptable, and also think outside the box, if so to speak, in terms of how you deliver your programs. And yeah, always keep your eyes on the prize. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. Fatima.
Yes, I suppose for me, the one thing is to align your project design to your evaluation design and make sure you're clear on the purpose, so that then after that, you can think about whether it's feasible and evaluable. So is it possible to do the things you want to do and find out the things you want to find out? And once you've sort of done that, you can be clearer about where you can find this data and how you can sort of collect it. But again, I suppose repeat from what I said earlier, is less is more. Instrument design is critical. Quality data is an important issue, and we must begin to do things more rapidly. So there are going to be there is going to be messiness in it, but when I say rapid, doesn't mean doesn't have quality, or it's not aligned with the key purpose and questions and evaluations, etc. Evaluation design. So it's just like Lawrence also said, being flexible, being adaptable, but focusing your eye on quality instruments and quality data.
Thank you, Fatima. And like you all to join me virtually in thanking our panelists. I think we've had some great input from them. I just want to show you, and one of the questions on the Q&A was whether the slides will be available, which they will be. I'm just going to mute Fatima. And in the slides, we've listed a whole a set of additional resources for you. The first one of which, as I mentioned earlier, is our new monitoring and evaluation topic on the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. I would encourage you to visit that. A lot more information on there. And the recording of this webinar, as well as the write-up of the key messages and the slides will all be available on that Knowledge Hub. But then there's a whole lot of additional resources there. And I just wanted to end by thanking everyone. Thanks for our participants for signing in, for participating in the polls, for asking questions. I hope this has helped and given you some practical tips on how to think about and do monitoring and evaluation moving forward. I've mentioned the Knowledge Hub. I'll mention again our conference coming up in a month. So we won't be having a webinar next month because we'll be having our 2 days of virtual conference. So go have a look at the program for that and sign up for that. And then our handbook, which is due out at the end of the year. But thanks for your participation. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all at the conference. Bye.